She worked at 6 different nursing homes in less than 3 years. At every single one of them, patients died under circumstances that colleagues found difficult to explain. At every single one of them, she was eventually released from employment for abusive behavior toward patients, for complaints from staff, for conduct serious enough to end the professional relationship each time. And then she moved on, to the next facility, to the next set of patients, to the next group of families who had no way of knowing what the previous institutions had documented about the woman now responsible for caring for their relatives. Nobody called law enforcement when she left. Nobody filed a report that triggered a criminal inquiry. Nobody looked at what was accumulating across 6 different buildings in 4 different counties and recognized it as a pattern that needed to be investigated as a whole. Heather Pressdee worked in the Western Pennsylvania healthcare system from 2020 to 2023, and 17 people died in her care before a single family member's telephone call to the Attorney General's office set off the investigation that eventually revealed what had been happening across that entire period. The case that followed did not originate from a regulatory system that had flagged a concerning cluster of deaths across multiple nursing homes. It began because one person made one call about one facility in one county. That call opened an investigation that expanded outward, one facility at a time, until the full scope of what Pressdee had done across 3 years became impossible to contain within any individual institution's files. And the question that runs through everything investigators eventually uncovered is not only what she did, it is how she was able to do it for 3 years, across 6 separate facilities, to 22 separate people, before anything stopped her. The answer to that question is what makes this case something more than the story of one nurse's crimes. It is the story of a system that failed the people it was built to protect, repeatedly and visibly, and kept moving forward anyway. Heather Pressdee was born in 1982 in Natrona Heights, Pennsylvania, a small community northeast of Pittsburgh. She attended the Community College of Allegheny County in the early 2000s, but did not complete a degree. She eventually obtained her registered nurse license and entered the healthcare workforce in Western Pennsylvania. Over the years that followed, she worked at facilities spread across Allegheny, Armstrong, Butler, and Westmoreland counties. According to prosecutors and the official court documents filed in connection with her case, the behavior that would eventually define her career was visible from early on. Colleagues raised concerns, administrators received complaints about how she treated the patients in her care. The complaints described contempt, open, undisguised contempt, for the people who depended on her for their basic needs and their survival. At Sunnyview Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Butler, the family of a patient named Nicholas Simbel described in a civil wrongful death lawsuit how Pressdee routinely insulted, berated, bullied, and abused him over the period of her employment there. They described how she prevented other nurses from providing him with food and water. They described the derogatory language she used about his brain injury in front of staff and in front of other patients. Nicholas Simbel was a brittle diabetic with an anoxic brain injury, blindness, and severe neuropathy. He was completely and entirely dependent on the people his family had entrusted with his care. He died at that facility while Heather Pressdee was working there. Prosecutors documented in court filings that Pressdee told another nurse at one of the facilities she worked at that a specific patient would be better off dead. That patient was not diabetic and had no clinical reason to receive insulin under any circumstances. He received an insulin injection from Pressdee anyway. He survived, but with serious and lasting medical consequences. The pattern, hostility toward a specific patient, followed by an unexplained medical crisis during Pressdee's shift, appeared at facility after facility, across counties, across years, without producing a coordinated response from anyone in a position to stop it. The text messages that investigators recovered during the case are among the most disturbing details in the public record of this prosecution. Between April 2022 and May 2023, Heather Pressdee sent a series of messages to her mother that prosecutors cited in court filings as evidence of her state of mind during the period when she was killing patients in her professional care. These messages are part of the permanent public record and were referenced directly in criminal proceedings. In April 2022, she sent her mother a message that read, "Can I kill this man at Taco Bell?" In June 2022, another, "I'm gonna murder already." In September 2022, she texted her mother about her co-workers, "Gonna murder my aides." Days after that, she sent a message about a specific patient she was currently responsible for, expressing hostility toward that person in explicit terms. These messages were written and sent by a registered nurse who was, during that same period, administering lethal doses of insulin to elderly and medically vulnerable patients at the facilities where she worked. Prosecutors argued that the messages, read alongside the documented timeline of what was happening inside those nursing homes, revealed a pattern of violent ideation that had not remained ideation, that it had moved into deliberate, repeated, premeditated action. Criminal profilers who reviewed the case after her arrest described Pressdee as someone whose violent impulses had been present long before she obtained her nursing license, and who found in the structure of institutional healthcare both a means of acting on those impulses and a layer of professional cover that made them difficult to detect from the outside. The patients she selected were elderly, seriously ill, and completely dependent on the people around them. They were people whose deaths could be attributed to their existing medical conditions, as long as no one was actively looking for a different explanation. The method Pressdee used was insulin. It is a compound that degrades in the body after death and becomes increasingly difficult to detect in post-mortem toxicology as time passes. In patients who are elderly and medically complex, patients carrying multiple diagnoses and a clinical history that could reasonably account for a sudden deterioration in condition, a death caused by an insulin overdose can present as natural and expected without prompting formal investigation, particularly if the treating facility does not suspect anything and does not initiate an inquiry. Pressdee administered lethal or potentially lethal doses of insulin to 22 patients across her career at multiple nursing homes. Some of those patients were diabetic and received insulin as part of their documented treatment plans, which meant that an overdose was harder to identify in the absence of a specific investigation with insulin as its focus. Others were not diabetic and had no clinical justification for receiving insulin under any circumstances. They received it anyway. 17 of the 22 patients died. 5 survived, though none of the survivors emerged without significant and lasting consequences. Betty Hutchinson survived the injection Pressdee gave her, but suffered a stroke as a direct result and permanently lost the ability to feed herself or to speak independently. Her niece, Marissa Hiles, described her current condition at the sentencing hearing. Jack Rogers had survived being shot down in a military helicopter during his service and had received the Purple Heart for what he endured. He was a resident of one of the Western Pennsylvania nursing homes where Pressdee worked. He did not survive her. His brother-in-law, Patrick Carney, addressed the court at sentencing and told the judge that Rogers had survived a war. He said the only justice their family was asking for was that what happened to Jack Rogers would never happen to another family. The investigation that eventually ended Pressdee's career and her freedom began in May 2023 when a family member of a patient at Quality Life Services, a skilled nursing facility in Chicora in Butler County, reported concerns to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office about the deaths of 2 patients at that facility. One was a 55-year-old man who died on December 4, 2022. The other was an 83-year-old patient who died on December 25th of the same year. Both deaths occurred while Pressdee was on shift at that facility. A third patient, a 73-year-old man, had been hospitalized in August 2022 after a dangerous medical episode during Pressdee's shift and had survived. When investigators began examining what had happened at Quality Life Services, they identified what the Attorney General's office described as a pattern of questionable conduct connected directly to Pressdee's presence and her scheduled shifts. She was arrested at her residence in Natrona Heights on May 25, 2023. She was charged initially with 2 counts of homicide, 1 count of attempted murder, aggravated assault, neglect of a care-dependent person, and reckless endangerment. She was held at Butler County Prison without bail. The investigation did not stop at Quality Life Services. Investigators traced Pressdee's full employment history through the other facilities where she had worked over the previous 3 years and examined every death and every serious medical emergency that had occurred during her time at each of those locations. In November 2023, the Attorney General's office announced that Pressdee had confessed to attempting to kill 19 additional patients across 5 other facilities between 2020 and 2023. The total across her entire career was 22 patients harmed, 17 were dead, and all of it had been uncovered from a single family's report about 2 deaths at one nursing home in one Pennsylvania county. What the investigation revealed, and what the civil lawsuits that followed Pressdee's arrest made explicit in hundreds of pages of filings, is the institutional failure that surrounded and enabled her career across 3 years. At each of the 6 facilities where she worked before her arrest, documented complaints about her conduct existed in the records of those institutions. At each of them, the response had been the same: discipline and departure, either through resignation or termination. Prosecutors stated in official court documents that Pressdee had a history of being disciplined for abusive behavior toward patients and staff at each facility, resulting in her resigning or being terminated. That language appears in the public record. The pattern it describes is clear and spans years across multiple employers within the same regional healthcare system. And yet no employer that released her from her position made a report to law enforcement or to the state nursing board that triggered a meaningful investigation of her conduct. No facility that subsequently hired her had access to or apparently sought information from previous employers about the specific nature of her departure. No regulatory mechanism existed that could aggregate the complaint information sitting in individual human resources files across multiple institutions and identify what those complaints, taken together, clearly indicated about this nurse's relationship to the patients placed in her care. The nursing homes where Pressdee's patients died are now defendants in civil wrongful death lawsuits brought by the families of those victims. Those lawsuits argue that the facilities bore a meaningful share of the responsibility for what happened, that the warning signs were present, were documented, and were visible at each institution individually, and that a functioning system of accountability should have intervened before 17 people were dead. On May 2, 2024, Heather Pressdee appeared in a Butler County courtroom and entered guilty pleas to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 19 counts of criminal attempt to commit murder. The plea was structured specifically to avoid the death penalty, which prosecutors had indicated they would seek if the case proceeded to trial. Before Judge Jeffrey Lieber imposed the sentence, family members of Pressdee's victims addressed the court directly and on the record. The daughter of victim Irene Simons told the courtroom she would never forgive Pressdee for what she had done to her mother. Patrick Carney spoke on behalf of Jack Rogers and described who Rogers had been, the kind of man who had served his country and survived a war, before Heather Pressdee killed him in a nursing home in western Pennsylvania. Marissa Hiles described the current day-to-day reality of her Aunt Betty Hutchinson, who was still alive but had been permanently changed by the stroke she suffered as a direct consequence of what Pressdee had done to her. Pressdee addressed the gathered families before the sentence was read. She told them she was sorry. When a television reporter from KDKA approached her outside the courthouse and asked her to speak about what she had just pleaded guilty to, she declined to comment and continued walking. Judge Lieber sentenced Pressdee to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, along with an additional consecutive sentence of 380 to 760 years for the 19 counts of attempted murder. Pennsylvania Attorney General Michelle Henry said after sentencing that the plea and the life sentence would ensure Pressdee never had another opportunity to harm anyone in her care. She acknowledged the families of every victim and stated clearly that the investigation had started because one family had come forward with concerns about what had happened to their relative. Heather Pressdee is currently incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution in Muncie, Pennsylvania. She will not leave that facility under any circumstances. The civil wrongful death lawsuits filed by the families of her victims against the nursing homes where their relatives died remain active in the civil court system, working toward findings about institutional responsibility that the criminal proceedings were not designed to address. Those cases ask a question the criminal case left open: whether the institutions themselves and the oversight systems that govern them bear a meaningful and legally cognizable share of the responsibility for 17 deaths that a properly functioning regulatory structure might have prevented years earlier. The criminal record Pressdee leaves behind is precise and extensively documented. 22 patients harmed across 6 facilities in 4 counties over 3 years. 17 dead, 5 survivors, each carrying permanent consequences from what was done to them. A registered nurse who sent text messages to her mother expressing the desire to kill strangers she encountered at restaurants and at her workplace while simultaneously administering lethal insulin to elderly and medically dependent patients who had been placed in her care by families who trusted the institutions responsible for their safety. A system that received complaints about this nurse at every facility she passed through, processed each one individually and in isolation, and allowed her to continue working in the regional healthcare workforce without ever aggregating the information it already had into the pattern that information clearly formed. The families who entrusted their relatives to those facilities did not do so expecting them to be harmed. They did so expecting the professional and humane care that those institutions existed to provide. That expectation is what Heather Pressdee violated 22 times across 3 years, and the question of how the system around her allowed that to keep happening is the part of this story that no sentence, however long, fully closes.